2340 hours. December 29th, 1944. The sky over Mindoro is not just dark, it is an absolute void. Inside the cockpit of the P-61 Black Widow christened times A-Wastin, the only light comes from the blood-red glow of the instrument panel and the radium dials vibrating with the hum of twin R. 2,800 double WASP engines. Major Carroll C. Smith is effectively blind. He is piloting a 30,000-pound aircraft at nearly 300 miles per hour, yet his eyes are useless against the tropical night. His survival and the lives of 20,000 engineers sleeping in the mud of McGuire Field below depends entirely on a voice in his headset and a chaotic green line of static on a cathode ray tube. Behind him, radar operator Philip Porter is staring at the scope of the SCR-720 radar. It isn't showing a single contact. It is lighting up with a swarm. The Japanese Empire has sent a desperate wave of bombers to crush the American beachhead before the invasion of Luzon can even begin. Smith advances the throttles. He is one pilot, in one aircraft, against an invisible enemy offensive hidden in the clouds. If he fails, the liberation of the Philippines dies tonight. To understand how one radar-guided predator attempted to hold back an entire empire, we must first understand the terrifying science of fighting in the dark. For 5 million years, the human eye has evolved to hunt in sunlight, relying on the contrast of shadow and color to detect movement. But at 10,000 feet over the Pacific, inside a cockpit hurtling through a moonless overcast, biology becomes a death sentence. By late 1944, the United States Army Air Forces had achieved total air superiority during the day. The P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt had swept the skies clean, diving on Japanese formations with faster engines and heavier guns. But the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, that technological dominance evaporated. The physics of aerial combat fundamentally change when you remove the horizon line. In the dark, there is no up or down. A pilot can spiral into the ocean while convinced he is climbing toward the stars. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service understood this biological limitation perfectly. They realized that the Americans were solar-powered predators. If the Japanese wanted to move troops, bomb airfields, or disrupt invasion fleets without being massacred, they simply had to wait for sunset. Darkness became their armor. They adopted a doctrine of nocturnal harassment, sending twin-engine Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers and lighter dive bombers to pound American positions, while the terrifying Mustangs sat impotent on the tarmac. For the American engineers building the airstrips on Mindoro, this reality was infuriating. They were working under floodlights that they had to kill the moment a distinct, unsynchronized drone of Japanese radial engines appeared overhead. They were being bombed with impunity, and the question screamed over the field radios was always the same: where are our fighters? The answer was a painful study in technical inadequacy. The Army had tried to plug the gap with stopgap solutions planes that were never designed to own the night. They took the Douglas A-20 Havoc, a rugged but heavy light bomber, painted it black, bolted a primitive radar to the nose, and called it the P-70. It was a disaster. The P-70 was too slow to catch a zero, too sluggish to climb with a bomber, and its radar was a complex nightmare that required the pilot to fly the plane while simultaneously squinting at a tiny scope. It was a case of task saturation. A pilot cannot manage engine manifold pressure, navigate through a storm, and interpret raw radar data all at once. Alternatively, they tried using P-38 Lightnings with ground-based searchlights. This was the circus method. Giant lights would sweep the sky, hoping to illuminate a Japanese bomber so a P-38 could pounce. It worked in theory, but in practice, the Japanese pilots simply flew around the lights or bombed the searchlight batteries first. The failure was systemic. The Americans were trying to fight a 20th century war with 19th century vision. The core problem, the fatal flaw, was the visual acquisition barrier. To shoot down an aircraft, you must identify it. At night, a bomber is just a hole in the stars. If a pilot is lucky, he might see the faint blue exhaust flames from the enemy engines, but the Japanese had begun installing flame dampeners to hide even that telltale sign. This created a lethal paradox for the interceptor. To find the enemy, you had to use radar to get close within 1,000 feet. But at 1,000 feet, flying at a closure rate of 300 miles per hour, you are seconds away from a mid-air collision. The pilot is essentially playing a game of chicken with a ghost. He has to trust the voice of his radar operator to guide him into the blackness, vectoring him toward a target he cannot see, praying that the blip on the screen isn't a friendly transport or a mountain peak. On Mindoro, the stakes of this failure were catastrophic. The engineers at McGuire Field weren't just building a runway. They were building the staging ground for the invasion of Luzon. General MacArthur's return to the Philippines depended on this mud strip. Every night the Japanese bombers got through. They cratered the runway, destroyed fuel dumps, and killed the men needed to pave the road to victory. Major Carroll Smith looked at the P-72s and the ad hoc night fighters and knew they were insufficient. You cannot win a high-tech war with retrofitted scavengers. To break the Japanese hold on the night, the army needed something heretical. They needed a machine that didn't just carry a radar, but was built around it. They needed a creature of the dark that could carry the heavy, complex avionics required to see the invisible without sacrificing the speed and lethality of a fighter. The solution that rolled onto the crushed coral of McGuire Field was monstrous. It was as big as a medium bomber, painted entirely in glossy jet black and armed with enough ordnance to sink a destroyer. It was the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. But to the traditional single-engine fighter pilots, it looked like a flying brick, a heavy, twin-boom science experiment that had no business in a dogfight. They looked at its massive wingspan and three-man crew and scoffed. They didn't understand that the era of the knight of the air, the lone pilot relying on sharp eyes and reflexes, was over. The era of the systems operator had begun. That shift in philosophy manifested physically in the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, a machine that looked less like a fighter plane and more like a piece of industrial architecture designed to kill. If the P-51 Mustang was a rapier, the Black Widow was a sledgehammer taped to a telescope. Standing on the tarmac, the P-61 was an intimidation tactic in itself. It sat on tricycle landing gear, looming over the ground crew with a 66-foot wingspan wider than a B-25 Mitchell bomber. It weighed over 30,000 pounds fully loaded, powered by the same massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines that drove the Corsair and the Hellcat. But unlike those carrier fighters, the Black Widow wasn't built for aerobatics. It was built to carry the heavy, delicate, and top-secret electronics that would pierce the darkness. To the stick and rudder purists of the Army Air Forces, the P-61 was an abomination. It didn't have a control stick, it had a control yoke, like a bomber or a cargo plane. It didn't have a sleek, single fuselage. It had a twin-boom tail that looked ungainly and dragged through the air. Pilots transferring from single-engine squadrons called it a flying truck and mocked its sluggish acceleration. They argued that you couldn't dogfight in a living room, and the P-61 central crew pod housing a pilot, a gunner, and a radar operator felt dangerously like a flying apartment. But Major Smith knew what the critics missed. The P-61 wasn't designed to turn inside a zero, it was designed to execute a mathematical assassination. The heart of this assassin was hidden in the nose. The front of the P-61 wasn't metal, it was a fiberglass radome, transparent to radio waves. Inside sat the Western Electric SCR-720, a 400-pound miracle of dipole antennas and vacuum tubes. This was the flying radio telescope. While the pilot flew the plane, the radar scanned the sky in a 180-degree cone, firing microwave pulses into the void and listening for the echo. However, interpreting that echo required a genius, not just a soldier. In the rear compartment, isolated in a tunnel of darkness, sat the radar operator, R.O., Lieutenant Philip Porter. His world was the C-scope. Unlike modern digital displays that clearly label enemies with red icons, the SCR-720 produced a chaotic mess of green luminescence. Clouds, mountains, and rain squalls all reflected radar energy, creating ground clutter that looked identical to a bomber formation. Porter had to mentally filter this visual noise, distinguishing the hard, rhythmic return of a metal fuselage from the soft, fuzzy return of a rain cloud. This created a unique command hierarchy that terrified traditional officers. In a P-51, the pilot was God. In a P-61, during an intercept, the pilot was merely the chauffeur. The radar operator gave the orders. Porter would stare at the green static, calculate the geometry of the intercept, and bark commands over the intercom. Hard port, 20 degrees. Nose up, 3 degrees. Target range 2 miles, closing speed 40 knots. Smith's job was to obey instantly. He had to fly blind, wrestling the heavy yoke to match Porter's vectors, trusting that his R.O. wasn't steering them into a mountain. It was a relationship of absolute, terrifying intimacy. If the R.O. was slow, they lost the target. If the R.O. was wrong, they died. The weapon they brought to the fight was equally heretical. Standard American fighters mounted machine guns in the wings. This created a problem called convergence. The bullets from the left and right wings had to travel inward to meet at a specific distance, usually 300 yards. If the target was closer or further than that 300-yard sweet spot, the bullets would spread out and miss critical components. The P-61 ignored this limitation. Its 420mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the belly, directly under the cockpit floor. They didn't need convergence. They fired straight ahead in a tight, parallel stream of high-explosive shells. Whether the target was at 50 yards or 500 yards, the stream of fire remained a concentrated buzzsaw. It was the difference between stabbing with a needle and punching with a fist. Yet, as impressive as the specs were on paper, the flying radio telescope had one critical weakness that couldn't be engineered away. It was complex. It required thousands of feet of copper wiring, sensitive vacuum tubes that blew out under G-forces, and hydraulic systems that leaked in the tropical heat. Bringing such a high-maintenance machine to a primitive, mud-caked forward operating base wasn't just ambitious. Logistics officers called it logistical suicide. But Smith didn't care about logistics. He cared about the engineers dying on Mindoro. He took his flying truck, his genius R.O., and his 4 cannons, and he flew them straight into the most unforgiving environment in the Pacific Theater. He was about to prove that a 30,000-pound science experiment could dance. That dance floor was McGuire Field, a jagged scar of crushed coral and mud carved out of the Philippine jungle just days before Christmas 1944. Mindoro wasn't a rear area sanctuary with paved taxiways and officers' clubs. It was the bleeding edge of the American advance, a frantic construction site situated barely 150 miles south of Manila. General Douglas MacArthur had bypassed thousands of Japanese troops to seize this island for one specific reason: leverage. If the Americans could hold Mindoro, their fighters could cover the impending invasion of Lingayen Gulf on Luzon. If they lost it, the invasion fleet would be naked against the kamikazes. The Japanese high command understood this geometry perfectly. They knew Mindoro was the dagger pressed against their throat, and for 2 straight weeks they had been trying to break the blade. The enemy that came for Major Smith wasn't the disciplined, pristine Imperial Navy of 1,941. This was the leftover empire, a ragtag but lethal collection of survivors. They threw everything they had left into the night skies over McGuire. They sent Mitsubishi G-4M Bettys, the cigar-shaped medium bombers that burned like torches. They sent Nakajima J-1N1 Irvings, specialized night fighters designed to hunt the hunters. They even sent their newest, most dangerous predator, the Nakajima Ki 84 Frank, a fighter that could outclimb a Mustang and outrun a Hellcat. On the ground, the situation was psychological torture. 20,000 American engineers and mud marines were working 24-hour shifts to lengthen the runway. They were pouring concrete and laying Marston matting perforated steel planks while staring at the sky. Every night, the air raid sirens would wail, forcing exhausted men to kill the floodlights and dive into water-filled foxholes. They learned to fear the sound of desynchronization. American engines hummed in a steady, synchronized harmony. Japanese bomber pilots, often exhausted and flying worn-out machines, rarely synchronized their propellers perfectly. The result was a pulsating, throbbing woom-woom-woom that echoed off the jungle canopy. It was the sound of impending death. When the engines stopped throbbing, the whistling began. The Japanese weren't just dropping high explosives. They were dropping anti-personnel fragmentation bombs and magnesium flares that turned the night into a blinding artificial noon. The engineers called them night hecklers. They would circle for hours, dropping a single bomb every 20 minutes just to keep the Americans awake, shattering their nerves before the main heavy bomber waves arrived to shatter the runway. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at McGuire on December 26th, taxiing their massive Black Widows onto the unfinished coral amidst active air raids. They were the only thing standing between the construction crews and the Japanese onslaught. There were no other night fighters in range. No P-51 seconds could help. It was entirely up to Smith and his squadron mates. By the night of December 29th, The atmosphere at McGuire was electric with dread. Intelligence reports indicated a maximum effort raid was inbound from Luzon. The Japanese were done heckling. They were coming to level the airfield. At 23:30 hours, the field phone in the 418th alert tent rang. The chaotic squawk of the ground control intercept (GCI) controller cut through the humid air. Red alert. Multiple bogeys. North of the field. Angels 8 to 12. Major Carroll Smith didn't run to his aircraft. He moved with the heavy, deliberate purpose of a man walking to an execution. He climbed the ladder into the belly of Times A-Wastin, strapping into the pilot's seat which sat high above the nose gear. Behind him, Lieutenant Philip Porter settled into the radar compartment, sealing himself into his windowless steel box. The startup sequence of a P-61 was a violent awakening. Smith engaged the starters, and the twin Pratt & Whitney R-2000 800 seconds coughed blue smoke before roaring into a chaotic idle. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure wave that shook the muddy ground. As Smith taxied to the end of the strip, he looked out at the jungle line. There were no runway lights, just kerosene smudge pots flickering in the humidity. He was sitting on top of 2,000 horsepower, armed with 4 cannons and a radar that could see the invisible. Yet the feeling in the cockpit wasn't dominance. It was isolation. The moment the wheels left the Coral, Smith and Porter would be severed from the world of men. They would be entering the Japanese domain. The system of rejection here was absolute. The Japanese refused to accept that the war was lost. They refused to let the Americans sleep. And tonight, they had sent a multi-layered strike force, bombers high, fighters low, specifically designed to overwhelm a single interceptor. They were betting that one American plane, no matter how advanced, couldn't be in 4 places at once. Smith lined up on the dark strip. He pushed the throttles forward to war, emergency power. The Black Widow lurched, gathering speed, its massive tires hammering over the uneven coral. At 100 miles per hour, Smith pulled back on the yoke. The nose wheel lifted, followed by the main gear, and Times A-Wastin clawed its way into the ink-black sky. The heavy thump of the landing gear retracting was the final seal. The vibration of the coral strip disappeared, replaced by the smooth, deadly hum of flight. Below them, the smudge pots vanished. Above them, there were no stars, only a suffocating ceiling of tropical storm clouds. Porter. Smith keyed the intercom, his voice flat and metallic. Power up the set. Let's see what they brought us. In the back, Porter flipped the master switch on the SCR-720. The vacuum tubes warmed up. The green sweep began to rotate. And then the scope lit up. The Japanese hadn't just brought a raid. They had brought a target-rich environment that defied the mathematics of survival. There were contacts everywhere to the north, to the west, stacking up at different altitudes like a staircase of threats. Smith wasn't hunting a stray bomber. He was flying straight into a traffic jam of enemy ordnance. The dance was about to begin, but the music was the unsynchronized thrum of Japanese engines, and the floor was rigged to explode. Porter filtered that chaos into a single, lucid vector. Contact, hard right, range 2 miles, altitude 8,000. Smith hauled the control yoke to the right. On a B-25 or a heavy bomber, such a violent input would have resulted in a sluggish, wallowing turn. But the Black Widow had a secret hidden in its wings. It didn't rely on traditional ailerons. It used spoilerons, perforated steel plates that popped up from the wing surface to kill, lift instantly on one side. The result was a 30,000-pound aircraft that could roll with the snap of a lightweight fighter. Times A-Wastin banked 60 degrees, its nose hunting for the invisible point in space Porter was describing. The first target was a Nakajima J-1, N-1 Irving, a Japanese night fighter hunting for the American bombers that weren't there. The Irving pilot was flying blind, likely staring at his own instruments, unaware that he was being painted by microwave energy from behind. Smith closed to within 500 feet. The silhouette solidified against the slightly lighter gray of the clouds. Smith didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger on the yoke. The belly of the P-61 erupted. The vibration was tectonic. 4 20mm cannons, firing high-explosive incendiary rounds, tore through the space between the aircraft. The Irving disintegrated. It didn't just crash. It ceased to be an aerodynamic form, transforming into a cloud of burning magnesium and aluminum that tumbled into the jungle below. One down, 1,100 rounds remaining. but the flash of the kill revealed the Black Widow's position. The element of surprise was evaporating. Porter's voice crackled again, urgent but controlled. New contact, 11 o'clock, low, closing fast. This was a Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber running a low-level attack profile toward the airfield. Smith pushed the nose over, diving into the murky air. The airspeed indicator wound past 300 miles per hour. As he closed on the Betty, Smith prepared for the violence of the kill, but he also braced himself for the specific, terrifying flaw of the P-61 that no manual could prepare a pilot for: flash blindness. In daylight, muzzle flash is negligible. In the absolute sensory deprivation of a moonless night, the muzzle flash of 4 20mm cannons is a strobe light detonating in a closet. Smith lined up the Betty's exhaust plumes in his optical sight and fired. The cockpit was instantly flooded with blinding white light. For 3 seconds, Smith was effectively blind, his retinas burned by the glare of his own guns. He couldn't see the enemy. He couldn't see his instruments. He had to fly entirely by physical sensation, pulling up violently to avoid colliding with the debris field he had just created. When his vision cleared, the sky was empty. A second fire was burning on the jungle floor. 2 down. The fatigue began to set in. Not physical tiredness, but the crushing mental weight of the C-scope. Porter was calling out a third target, but this one wasn't flying straight and level. It was maneuvering. It was a Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar, or perhaps the newer Ki 84 Frank, a single-engine fighter that was nimble, fast, and now fully aware that a predator was in the dark with them. The Japanese pilot broke left, diving toward the water. Smith followed, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. This was the test of the spoilerons. A P-61 should not have been able to stay inside the turn of a single-engine fighter, but Smith forced the heavy beast around, trading altitude for position. The radar couldn't hold the lock in the violent maneuvering. The ground clutter from the nearby hills was washing out the return. "I've lost him," Porter shouted. The electronic eye was blind. Smith looked out the canopy. He saw a flicker of blue flame, the enemy pilot jamming his throttle forward, trying to escape. Smith switched to visual pursuit, guessing the lead. He pulled the nose of the Black Widow ahead of the Shadow and fired a deflection burst, a spray-and-pray tactic that was technically forbidden due to ammo conservation. The stream of 20mm shells walked into the path of the turning fighter. The enemy plane didn't explode, it simply lost its wing. The lift imbalance flipped it into a violent snap roll, sending it spiraling into the Sibuyan Sea. 3 down. But the victory was hollowed out by the fuel gauge. The P-61 was a thirsty animal. Combat maneuvering full throttle, high G turns drank high-octane fuel at a catastrophic rate. The needles were dropping past the safe reserve markers. Smith did the mental math. He had enough gas to circle the field and land, or he had enough to hunt one more target. He didn't have enough for both. Then Porter called it. Target 4, dead ahead. He's lined up on the runway. A fourth bomber, another Betty, was on its final run toward McGuire Field. If Smith turned back now, he would land safely, but that bomber would drop its payload directly onto the tents of the 418th Squadron. Smith didn't turn back. He pushed the throttles to the stops, ignoring the engine temperature gauges redlining. He was trading his safety margin for airspeed. He closed on the bomber with reckless speed, closing rate over 100 knots. He was coming in too fast. If he fired now, he would fly right through the explosion. He chopped the throttles to idle, deploying the air brake's large slats on the wings designed to dirty the airframe. The P-61 shuddered, slowing violently. He hung in the air, suspended 200 yards behind the bomber's tail gunner. The Japanese gunner opened fire. Tracers zipped past the P-61's canopy, green streaks in the night. Smith didn't flinch. He walked his rudder pedals, yawing the nose just enough to center the Betty's fuselage in his sight. He depressed the trigger and held it. He emptied the guns. The cannons roared for 4 continuous seconds, shaking the airframe until it felt like the rivets would pop. The Betty absorbed the punishment for a heartbeat, then vanished inside a fireball so bright it illuminated the whitecaps of the ocean below. Smith pulled up hard, banking away from the shockwave. He looked at his panel. The ammunition counters read 0. The fuel gauges were bouncing on the empty pegs. The sky was silent again, save for the starving cough of his own engines. He had achieved the impossible 4 kills in 80 minutes, but now the adrenaline was gone, and the physics of flight were calling in their debt. The hunter was now a glider, falling toward a black island with dry tanks. That silence was the sound of a countdown reaching zero. The twin R-2800 engines, which had roared with 4,000 horsepower of violence for the last 80 minutes, were now surging and coughing. The manifold pressure needles were fluctuating wildly, the mechanical symptom of fuel starvation. The main tanks were dry. The reserve tanks were vapor. Major Smith wasn't flying an aircraft anymore. He was managing a controlled crash of 15 tons of aluminum and steel. He banked times A-Wastin toward the magnetic heading of McGuire Field. There was no question of diverting. The nearest alternate strip was Leyte, hundreds of miles away across open ocean. It was McGuire or the jungle. "Porter, give me a vector for home," Smith said. His voice was calm, the forced tranquility of a man who knows panic burns oxygen he doesn't have. "Heading 180, Porter replied. "Distance 8 miles. You should see the field lights at 12 o'clock. Smith looked out the front windscreen. He saw nothing. The smudge pots that had marked the runway upon takeoff were gone. Either the ground crew had extinguished them due to the air raid, or the tropical rain squalls had snuffed them out. The result was the black hole effect, a sensory illusion where the pilot cannot distinguish the sky from the ground or the ocean. Without a horizon and without runway lights, depth perception ceases to exist. Smith was descending into a void at 140 miles per hour. If he leveled off too high, he would stall and drop like a stone. If he descended too low, he would fly straight into the canopy of the Philippine jungle, cartwheeling the aircraft into a fireball that would kill them instantly. "No visual on the field," Smith reported. "We're going in on instruments." This was the ultimate test of the night fighter doctrine. In 1944, instrument landing systems, ILS, as we know them, did not exist on forward mud strips. There were no glide slope beams to follow. Smith had to rely on a terrifying piece of technology called the SCR-718 radar altimeter. Unlike a standard altimeter, which measured air pressure and could be tricked by weather changes, the SCR-718 fired a radio pulse directly down at the Earth and timed the bounce back. It gave the absolute height above the terrain, accurate to within feet. But it required absolute faith. Smith had to ignore his instincts, which were screaming that he was too low, and trust a bouncing needle on the panel. "Reading 600 feet, Porter called out from the back, reading his repeater scope. "Gear down," Smith said. He dropped the heavy landing gear lever. The hydraulic system groaned. The extra drag hit the airframe like a physical blow, bleeding off critical airspeed. The starving engines protested, coughing as the fuel pumps sucked at the bottom of the tanks. 400 feet. Smith fought the yoke. The P-61 was wallowing now, heavy and unresponsive near its stall speed. He couldn't add power to correct the descent rate because adding power might suck the last pint of fuel and kill the engines entirely. He had to glide it in, threading a needle in the dark. 300. "You're drifting left, Major. Correct right. 3 degrees. Smith nudged the rudder. The jungle was invisible, but he could imagine the trees rushing up to grab the landing gear. 200 feet. 100. The darkness outside was absolute. Smith's eyes were locked on the airspeed indicator and the gyro horizon. 110 miles per hour. 105. He was flirting with the stall. 50 feet. Porter's voice was tight. 30. 10. Smith pulled the yoke back into his stomach, flaring the massive aircraft blindly. He waited for the crash. Thump. The main wheels hammered into the crushed coral. It wasn't a smooth landing, it was a controlled collision. The nose gear slammed down a second later. Smith stood on the brakes, praying the tires wouldn't blow, praying they wouldn't slide off the slick coral into the mud. The Black Widow shuddered and skidded, the anti-lock brakes of the future, a distant dream. The aircraft ground to a halt. Smith didn't taxi. He couldn't. As the momentum bled away, the port engine sputtered and died. 3 seconds later, the starboard engine quit. The propellers spun down to a halt. Sudden, ringing silence. For a long moment, neither man moved. The cockpit, which had been a cacophony of wind, engine roar, and gunfire for nearly 2 hours, was now stiflingly quiet. The humidity of the jungle rushed in through the vents. Smith looked down at his hands. They were trembling uncontrollably, the adrenaline dump hitting him all at once. He unclipped his oxygen mask and took a breath of the heavy, wet air. It smelled of burnt cordite and aviation fuel. The canopy slid open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness from the ground. It was the crew chief, scrambling up onto the wing, his face a mask of anxiety. "Major, we heard the shooting. We saw the flashes. What's the count?" Smith climbed out, his legs stiff. He looked at the empty gun bays, scorched black from the heat of the cannons. He looked at the fuel caps, dry as a bone. Then he looked toward the jungle perimeter, where thousands of American engineers were climbing out of their foxholes, alive, their equipment intact, the runway ready for tomorrow's work. "4," Smith said quietly. "We got 4 of them." The crew chief froze. 4 kills in a single sortie was unheard of. In the span of 80 minutes, Smith and Porter had effectively wiped out an entire Japanese flight. They had achieved ace-in-a-day status when combined with a kill from earlier that morning, not in a glorious dogfight under the sun, but in a gritty, terrified brawl in the dark. But the real victory wasn't the score. It was the silence. The air raid sirens didn't wail again that night. The night hecklers were gone. The Japanese high command, realizing that the darkness was no longer a sanctuary but a trap, pulled back their bombers. The psychological siege of McGuire Field was broken. Because of Time's A-Wastin, the engineers finished the runway. Because the runway was finished, the P-38 seconds and P-51 seconds arrived in force. And 10 days later, on January 9th, 1945, when the massive American invasion fleet steamed into Lingayen Gulf to liberate Luzon, they did so under an umbrella of steel provided by the base Carroll Smith had saved. The heretical experiment had worked. The P-61 wasn't a flying truck, it was the future. It proved that in modern war, the pilot with the biggest gun doesn't win. The pilot who can see is the one who survives. That survival instinct, the realization that information dominance outweighs raw horsepower, didn't end when the sun rose over Mindoro. It gestated in the design bureaus of California, specifically within the mind of Jack Northrop, the visionary engineer who had birthed the Black Widow. In the history of aviation, there is a distinct before and after, marked by the P-61. Before the Black Widow, fighter aircraft were designed around the engine. The logic was simple. Get the biggest piston engine available, bolt a cockpit and some machine guns to it, and hope it went faster than the enemy. The pilot's eyes were the primary sensor, and the Mark I eyeball has a hard limit of a few miles. The P-61 flipped this hierarchy. It was the first aircraft in history designed entirely around a sensor. The fuselage was essentially a flying casing for the SCR-720 radar. The engines and wings were secondary to the electronics. This shift, placing the eye above the muscle, is the foundational philosophy of modern air warfare. Today, we call it sensor fusion, the governing principle of fifth-generation fighters like the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II. But in 1944, it was heresy. Jack Northrop's obsession with breaking aerodynamic norms didn't stop with the radar. The Black Widow was a testbed for the mechanical DNA that would define the future of stealth. Consider the spoilerons. As Major Smith fought the heavy aircraft through the turns over the Sibian Sea, he wasn't using traditional ailerons. Northrop had deleted them to allow for massive, full-span flaps that let the giant plane land on short, mud-caked runways like McGuire Field. To turn the plane, small perforated gates popped up on top of the wing, disrupting airflow. Engineers at the time called it overcomplicated. Today, if you look at the wings of the Northrop B-2 Spirit, the stealth bomber that is the crown jewel of the U.S. Air Force, you will find the direct descendants of those P-61 spoilerons. The lineage is undeniable. The Black Widow was the grandfather of the B-2, sharing not just a manufacturer, but a design philosophy, that the unique requirements of the mission dictate the shape of the aircraft, convention be damned. Furthermore, the relationship between Major Smith and Lieutenant Porter pioneered the concept of the complex crew. In the single-seat fighters of the era, the pilot was overwhelmed, managing navigation, engine settings, communications, and gunnery simultaneously. The P-61 introduced the specialized division of labor that would dominate the Cold War. Smith flew, Porter hunted. This dynamic evolved directly into the F-4 Phantom and the F-14 Tomcat. Every RIO radar intercept officer who sat in the back of a Tomcat, managing the AWG-9 radar system while the pilot flew the plane, owes their job description to the early radar operators like Philip Porter. They were the first generation of warriors who fought wars by looking at screens rather than out of windows. Despite this revolutionary impact, The physical legacy of the P-61 was brutally short. The dawn of the jet age made piston-engine fighters obsolete almost overnight. By 1950, the Black Widows were being scrapped, their massive R-2800 engines repurposed or melted down. A-Wastin, the aircraft that saved the Mindoro beachhead, did not survive preservation. It was likely chopped into aluminum ingots, its history erased by the very progress it helped accelerate. But while the airframes disappeared, the doctrine conquered the world. The U.S. Air Force stopped building dogfighters and started building interceptors, aircraft designed to kill from beyond visual range, BVR. The F-89 Scorpion, the F-102 Delta Dagger, and the F-106 Delta Dart were all spiritual children of the Black Widow heavy, radar-equipped missile carriers designed to hunt in the dark. Major Carroll Smith's mission proved that a pilot didn't need to see the enemy to kill them. He proved that a glowing green blip and a calm voice on the intercom were deadlier than the sharpest eyes in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Black Widow taught the military a lesson that defines the 21st century. In the modern arena, he who controls the spectrum controls the sky. The darkness is no longer a shield for the enemy. It is a canvas for the radar. That canvas, however, was painted by men who never asked for the spotlight. While the daylight aces like Richard Bong and Pappy Boyington were having their photos taken for newsreels, the night fighters lived in a different world, a world of red-lit cockpits, caffeine, and solitude. When Major Carroll Smith shut down the engines of A-Wastin on the morning of December 30th, he didn't step out to a cheering crowd. He stepped out to a silent, humid airfield that was safe only because he had made it so. Smith survived the war with 7 confirmed kills, making him the top-scoring night fighter ace of the Pacific. But his true tally isn't measured in downed Japanese aircraft. It is measured in the thousands of American engineers, Marines, and sailors who woke up on the morning of January 9th, 1945, to launch the invasion of Lingayen Gulf. They marched onto the beaches of Luzon, under a sky that had been swept clean by the flying trucks and the men who stared at green static until their eyes burned. Smith returned to the United States in 1946 and quietly slipped back into civilian life. He never wrote a memoir. He never sought fame. Like the radar waves he commanded, his contribution was invisible to the naked eye, yet absolutely critical to the architecture of victory. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron proved that the system of rejection, the belief that technology couldn't overcome the chaos of night combat, was false. They demonstrated that with enough courage and the right engineering, even the darkest hour could be turned into a hunting ground. Major Smith mastered the darkness using radar, effectively breaking the visual barrier of combat. But across the world, in the high-altitude skies over Europe, another American pilot was trying to break a different kind of barrier, one made of solid air. He was diving a P-47 Thunderbolt so fast that the controls froze, locking him into a death plunge known as compressibility. We will uncover the terrifying physics of the terminal velocity dives and the tragedy that was covered up for decades in our next report. If this analysis gave you a new respect for the pioneers of the night, do your part to keep their signal alive. Hit that like button. It is the only way to tell the algorithm that these stories matter. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next briefing on the P-47's battle with the speed of sound. And check the pinned comment below. We want to know which forgotten aircraft you think deserves the architect treatment next. Dismissed.